Oh, there it is. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And we really appreciate you joining us for our third conversation in our series of conversations on race and gender, focusing on Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls. Today, we're speaking to Asian American women who have run for office to hear their stories and to also remember the legacy of our first elected Asian American woman to Congress, Patsy Mink. In 1964, Patsy Mink of Hawaii became the first woman of color elected to Congress. And in her 24 years in Congress, she co authored Title IX and advocated for critical issues such as immigrant rights and child care. Today, more Asian American women are represented in the ranks of American government than ever before, from the first South Asian woman to be elected vice president to progressive Asian American women in state legislatures across the United States. Join us as we further discuss this conversation and get to meet some really amazing women on this panel. So I'm going to introduce our panelists without further ado, and then get started with just hearing more about their journey and their stories. And before we get started, just wanted to note that Representative Grace Meng is going to be joining us halfway through this panel as she had a scheduled conflict, but we're so glad for her making time to join us on this panel. And so, in fact, as I read the bio, you will see that we have a really diverse group of women who have run for various levels of offices and very different positions in different places in our country. So first, I would like to introduce to you actually my very own representative, Kem Kwon. Kem is a leader in the immigrant and refugee community, and in 2017, Kem was elected commissioner of the Skokie Park District, which I just have to say is amazing park district that my family enjoys living here in Skokie, and became the first Cambodian American woman to be elected to any public office in the United States. And then this past April, Kane became an elected member of the Skokie Village's Board of Trustees. And Kem is committed to helping local government be accessible so more people can be engaged as valued members of the community. And then next, and for those of you listening, you're like, where is Skokie? We are in the state of Illinois. It's a village, it's a suburb of Chicago. And next, I want to introduce to you Seema Lajavardian. Seema is a lawyer and a mother of two, a breast cancer survivor, and a community leader, an immigrant and political activist helping uplift social justice causes and build bridges between communities. She became a senior advisor and finance chair to Beto O'Rourke's campaign during his 2018 US Senate race and 2020 presidential run. Seema ran against Representative Dan Crenshaw as a Democratic nominee for Texas's second congressional district in 2020, which I believe is in the Houston area. And next we have Betty Yee, who, with more than 35 years of experience in public service, State Controller Betty Yee was elected in November 2014, following 2 terms of service on the California Board of Equalization. Ms. Yee is only the 10th woman in California's history to be elected to a statewide office. That is surprising. She is dedicated to creating incentives to increase the number of affordable housing units, spur economic development, support pollution control innovation, and strengthen health and educational facilities. And lastly, who, as I mentioned earlier, will be joining us about halfway through this panel is Representative Grace Meng, who is serving her 3rd term in the U.S. House of Representatives and represents the 6th Congressional District of New York, which is in New York City. She's the first Asian American member of Congress from New York State and only Congress member of Asian descent in the entire Northeast. Grace has passed several pieces of legislation about religious freedom, making Queens historic sites part of the National Park Service, striking quote unquote Oriental from federal law, and protecting public housing residents from insufficient heat. So as you can see, we have an amazing group of women who've done so much to serve our country and our communities. And really, the folks that are tuning in to listen on this panel, I think may have aspirations of their own to run for office or may be really encouraged by you all. You know, I often say sometimes it takes somebody that looks like me to encourage me to do what I didn't think was possible. And so, really, the goal of today's panel is to hear your stories as human beings, as Asian American women, as immigrants, as children of immigrants, and telling your story about why what you have done and the choices you've made to run for office is so important to us. So thank you so much for joining us. So um, I'm going to ask a set of questions, and I would love for everybody to chime in as we go. When Representative Meng shows up, I'll give her a little time to just answer the background question, just of like why she decided to run, since we're going to be doing that earlier, and then we'll jump back into the other questions that we have. So my first question is the obvious one: why did you run for office, and what inspired you? Let's start with Kem.
All right. So I had never considered running for public office prior to this. So about 5 years ago, I was approached and I was asked to run. And just taking a step back, I am the child of Cambodian refugees. I came here at 6 months old. So my experience, with English being a second language, Khmer, the Cambodian language, was my primary language growing up, and um, my family, as genocide survivors, had always had a huge distrust of government, and in general, just they're still going through PTSD, and so there's this fear and this anxiety, right, that they have, and that was the sort of very sheltered environment that I grew up in, and so. To go from that to being asked to run for public office was something that I had never imagined ever doing. Um, but at the time, that was right before the 2016 presidential election. My kids, they were very young and very engaged, and they were keeping up with us as we were keeping up with what was happening nationally. My daughter, who was in kindergarten, spent the summer reading up on Barack Obama's biography, Hillary Clinton's biography, and she was really inspired by Hillary Clinton, the potential of having our first female president. And so it was really disappointing when we got the news, and having to break that news to her for that first week after the election. Um, she was very clingy and very sad and emotional every time I dropped her up at school. And finally, the teacher asked me if everything was okay, and that was when it hit me, because we were taking the election results so hard. That was also impacting our kids, and around the same time, the board president of the Skokie Park District, Jerry Clarito, who was the first Asian American to hold a seat in the Skokie Park District, he was Filipino American, and I had done work with him previously as a community organizer, working within a broader coalition. So that's how we had built that relationship. So he knew what I stood for and the work that I'd done within the community. And even then, I was questioning myself about what impact being involved with the park district would have, given everything that was happening in the national conversation. But then I realized it was really important for me to create a safe and welcoming space for my kids and for other families, so that at least we can impact change within our local corner of the world. And so that was sort of ultimately what led me to my decision to run for public office. And in doing so, I didn't realize until the night that I actually won that not only was I the first Cambodian American in the state of Illinois to get elected, but I was also the first Cambodian American woman in the country to be elected to any position. Since that time, I've realized, what a significant impact it is for a community that has been so fragmented and traumatized by war, and to be able to um, begin to realize that we also have a voice, and we're here to stay in America, and we are Americans, and not just outsiders. We've since seen a number of other Cambodian American women successfully run for public office across the country as well. So I'm really excited about that.
Yay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that story. That's so inspiring. Seema, we'd love to hear from you.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. It's such an honor and to be among people who have gone through similar stories that we all go through and stepping up and making a change in the community. I'm originally from Iran, and my grandmother, during her time, was one of the first women in Congress and helped pass the women's right to vote. So I always grew up in that environment. And then we had the revolution, and my family and I had to flee. And really, we came here because of really the promise and the power of the American dream. English was my fourth language. You know, it's like all immigrant stories, education was extremely important. You know, my parents emphasized that because that's how, all of us could contribute and become part of this community. And I spent years just trying to bring all the communities together because I was very lucky. I was able to go to law school. I ended up, flourishing, establishing myself. I have two kids. And then suddenly in 2016, when Trump got elected, I truly felt that we're going through another revolution here. And there's this incredible, terrible atmosphere of hatred and xenophobia. And I just started getting more and more involved and realized that I needed to get all the communities to understand how important it is to have a voice and get active. So I met Beto and I helped him for his run in the US Senate. I organized all the different groups. Houston, Harris, Texas is extremely diverse, even though people may not believe that, but it's a very diverse place. And just really wanted all the communities to understand that our voices matter because it's affecting our community so much. And, we had a huge trigger of down ballot races in 2018. I went on to his 2020 race. And then when he dropped that, I was being heavily recruited. As Kem said, I had never really thought of running for office. But when I thought, if I can actually make a difference, and what would I be teaching my kids or anybody else thinking to run for office if I don't step up and do the job? And it was difficult. I jumped in last minute in a three-way primary with a very funny last name, with an accent, being Muslim, being Asian. And it was I just knew that I had to step up, and it mattered so much. And that's why I'm so excited to be among so many women who have done that. So, and I think my grandmother would be very proud too.
And we are very proud of you, Tusima. And Betty, we'd love to hear about your various journeys. I mean, you've had quite the career.
Yeah, thank you, Sung, and it's so great to join Kim and Seema on this panel, and really an honor. I think for all of us, this was not like a teenage dream we had to run for office, and so it definitely was not mine. And what really inspired me, though, was something that happened when I was a teenager, and that is I'm a daughter of immigrants, and my family, I grew up poor, the second oldest among six children, and my parents had a laundry and dry cleaning business and didn't speak English. And so with a family business and a common immigrant experience, the children were the best workers of the family business. And so I was really their advocate in so many ways, and, took care of a lot of the financial aspects of the business, the banking and negotiating with vendors. And what inspired me to really think about running for office is just for how many communities there are for which there are no advocates, and especially as we see a diverse state like California, where we're going to become we are a minority majority right now, and to see this happen, and for people to see who is representing them isn't really they don't look like them. And so for me, it was an easy decision to run for a seat that I had built a discipline around in finance and tax. And I wasn't asked to run. This is interesting. I actually got inspired to run because I saw who was interested in running for the state's tax commission. And I've been doing this work for so long. And this was just going to be a stepping stone for so many of the other candidates. And I decided, the hell with that. I mean, this is like my discipline. And so I decided to run, and it's been a successful career since then. But I think for all of us, and what I don't want to have lost is, I think about who's not at the table a lot. And I think for each of us, it is really a great progression of finally, having more diverse voices at the table. We still have a long ways to go. Your introduction to me as only the 10th woman ever to hold statewide office in California since statehood, that's abysmal. and we need to do more. So I don't intend to be the last.
That's, thank you for saying that. I mean, I read it over and over. I was like, it can't be true,
It's
but it
true.
is,
For
right?
progressive California, yes.
Right, right. All that California espouses and stands for, that is pretty surprising. And, and all of you kind of talked about, the importance of partially importance of representation. And Seema, thank you for normalizing having long last names. I mean, I think there's just so many, I can't say enough how um, I have a 6-year-old, and for her to see folks like you, your names on posters, your faces in pamphlets, like, to normalize that's what democracy looks like, that these are the folks who get to lead our country. It's like a different time and different world we live in. And so, I mean, this question might sound a bit redundant and obvious, but I would love for your take on it, a little bit more is, like, why do you, and it's an obvious question, but just want to hear your perspective on it, on why it's so important for people that look like us to run for office. Let's start with Betty this time.
Thank you for the questions. It's important because I think about just all of the issues that really are of concern to our communities and how often they are really not being addressed, by those who represent us. And so on a very, very fundamental level, to just, have people in office who just understand our daily experiences, our lived experiences, and to be able to take that to inform the work that we do in our respective positions, in elected office, I think is really important. But the other thing is, I think about this democracy and how, there's just so much about our democracy that is so fragile right now and seemingly under attack. And I've always thought that the strongest democracies are those where everyone has the ability to fully participate in it. And I think at least for me, when I think about my service in office, I hope it does provide some inspiration about getting involved, being engaged, and knowing that, I, as a daughter of immigrants who grew up poor, can now serve as the, CFO of the 5th largest economy in the world. I mean, just to show what's possible, I think is really important. And it really gives me a lot of hope that there are a lot more 8API women running for office, and really understanding that and bringing to the table, their own lived experiences, knowing that so many share them, and that's what's going to inform a lot of the decisions we make in our official capacities.
That really resonates, I think, with many of us, knowing that I don't have to explain my story to you.
Exactly.
You represent me. So, Kev. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, here we go. So even though I didn't realize I was going to run for public office, and as I sit here and think about that, it's very personal. When I grew up in a culture and a community that had been completely decimated by war and genocide. And, as refugees, we came here and we sort of had to rebuild our lives from scratch. I didn't have a role model to look at up to. And so, like, whenever I get that question about who your role model was growing up, like, we came from a very broken community. There was a lot of our parents. I grew up where I was the adult in the family. Parents having gone through PTSD and depression that was never treated, helping them to navigate, even though they had their own small business. By the time I was in high school, I was helping to manage that business and figuring out, all the aspects of it. And so I had to grow up very quickly and not feeling like I quite had that childhood experience. And there really wasn't anything to look up to. And then even something as simple as small as like the park district. I've seen it in my own children. I've seen it in my nieces and nephews where they see my picture, my face at the park district walls, and they're like, "That's my mom. That's my aunt, or whoever that is." My son now thinks he wants to aspire to be the first Asian man president because he thinks we're going to have a female Asian president before we have a male Asian president. I'm like, that's his reality, and it's not a normal reality, right? But like that, I didn't have that growing up. We never thought of that. And I remember even just a few years ago, my nephew who was in kindergarten was told to go back to his country, and he said, you go back to your country. I was born here in America and I'm American. And for him as a kindergartner to be able to respond that way, for so long we've been feeling like we don't belong here and that we're not part of the American dream. And at the end of the day, like, this is our way of saying we're American, we're here to stay, and we're just as much a fabric of American society as anything else. So in that way, I feel like it is important for us to have representation in government, not only for the communities that we serve, but also for the young people who are looking at us and thinking about their future. Like, there's a space for them to step into, and that we're not going to be the last, that there's going to be a legacy for them to follow.
Thank you for that. That's just so, I mean, that's got to be quite experience, like walk into Park District and see your mom's picture. And to be honest, I think for my daughter, seeing an Asian American woman, like I think that's just amazing that we get to. It's a very special way for our children to grow up, and that's also amazing that your son is like, I'm going to be the first Asian man because he's going to be a first Asian American woman.
He's all about the woman because it's the women's world right now. And he's like, why can't we have men's marches? Like, because you have that every day. And that's why we go to the women's marches.
I love it. You're raising a feminist, and that's that is just so heartwarming to hear. Seema, why do you think it's important for folks like you, who's a Muslim, who's a person of color, who talks with a non-American accent, with a long last name? Why should people like you run? Why is that important?
I mean, look, to Kem's point, it's funny because there is the perpetual foreigners. We're still depicted as foreigners, where really I think 1 in 3 Asian Americans are actually born here. So the fact that there's this perpetual, you have to explain that, we are not all foreign born. Like it's important that we're all from here. But for me, I think the most important thing is that we have to show representation. And I think being Asian Americans, we understand our communities better and can give that explanation and depiction to others so that we educate better. And a lot of it has to do with that. And a lot of it has to do with inspiring younger people to know that, yes, I can do that also. I had an intern on my campaign. She was a junior in high school when she started with me. She was South Asian and was very confused what she wanted to go more, become a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. And she interviewed for Yale and got into Yale for political science. And she called me after she got in. She goes, I told them my interview was that when I helped you on your campaign, I was so inspired that somebody like you is running, who's not afraid, who's relentless. And you taught me that I need to do that. And this is what I'm going to do. And this was my interview. I got accepted and I'm going to run for office when I'm older. And I had so many of those conversations with so many young people that it gave them hope that it's possible, that we can have a voice, and we need to have a voice. And I think, Lucy Bain Johnson is from Texas, and she was active. And I told her one day, I said, look, because of your father, the National Origin Act passed in 1965, we're here and we have voices, and we have to be able to use those voices and make these differences so that everybody coming up has a future in this country. So it's very important.
That's just, it's really the stories, right? And I think this is why we wanted to host this panel, is because, like, no doubt, like, at least in our mind, that y'all are competent, the issues that you run on, the things you want to support our country to do, like, those are all great. But, like, it's these stories that what I really wanted to hear, right? Like, about how are you influencing and inspiring your son, the young folks who volunteered on your campaign. I mean, I think that's really it's just amazing. Of course, running for office is it's so inspiring for the rest of us that are watching it and helping out, but I'm sure it's grueling and it's tough and it's challenging. And especially for our viewers who are considering or may consider, we do want to hear the good, bad, and the ugly, and would love to hear what you thought were the most challenging parts about running for office. Let's start with Seema on this one.
I ran in a pretty red district against, like, the darling of the Republican Party. So it was challenging. There was a lot of preconception within the community at large, because I was an immigrant, Muslim, Asian American, funny last name, and all of that, and having to really show that, I'm among the same group of people. And I saw that in the primary, winning the three-way primary with three people who had much easier last names than I did. But I also feel that within our own communities, there is a bias towards men as opposed to women. So also proving yourself as a woman within our own communities was a challenge that, you have to, it's the reality you just have to work for. So that all really led into, obviously, fundraising is huge. Like, you run for office, you have to raise a lot of money. My opponent spent $18 million in my race, and I ended up raising $4 million. But a lot of that had to do with having a lot of conversations, people, and having to explain why I am the best candidate for that. Whereas I think necessarily having not been who I am, it might not have been as difficult. But I'm very happy because I think, changed a lot of perceptions even by talking and having these conversations. But I would say that it was a great challenge, but it was also taught me a lot and taught many other people a lot about our backgrounds.
Thank you. What about you, Betty? What's been the toughest part of running a campaign?
I would say it's probably the most difficult part of anything in public life, and that is, just really trying to hang on to your authentic self. Campaigns are it's an industry, it's a business, and whether you're working with professional consultants or maybe you're doing fundraising calls, but how do you put forth just truly who we are, and we're being assessed and measured by frankly, criteria that were established for, white male candidates, and yet the richness of what we bring to the table never even gets to be spoken. And so I think that was something I really tried to do at every turn, because when we were able to speak about that, we made so many connections with people, and that engagement with, just someone who maybe wasn't even all that heavily involved, or maybe was involved, but just that kernel of, kind of a connection that you were able to make with them. Whether the fact that, I was a descendant of immigrants, or that I came from a small business background with my family, just those aspects of it I thought was tough. But this whole thing about being judged and assessed about whether we measure up was just really tough for me, because it's so degrading and it's demoralizing, frankly. And yes, we have to raise the money. I mean, I raised millions of dollars from my races, and that's a given. But we don't have to raise the most money just to be viable. But I think the best way to be viable is just to talk about all of the experiences that we have had, both professionally and personally, that really can be helpful in terms of how we can be, just great elected officials. And so I think that was really the toughest part, was, how not to lose our authentic selves, to get our stories out there, and to just make those connections that at the end of the day, it's the vote that matters, including, obviously, getting our message out with the money that we raise.
Thank you, Betty. And right before Kim answers this question, I just want to acknowledge and welcome Representative Meng. Thank you for joining us. Kim and Betty and Seema have been inspiring us for the last 30 minutes or so. And this question that I've just asked them is, what has been the toughest part about running a campaign? After Kim answers, I'd love to just ask you a little bit more about background, about why you ran, and then we can kind of join in the conversation again. So, Kim, what's the toughest part about running for office?
I would echo a lot of what Betty and Seema talked about. I think, one of the biggest challenge is, as an Asian American, we're sort of going against the grain. And so we're constantly being questioned about whether or not we're good enough. Are we experienced enough? I think being an Asian American, and also being a woman, right? And so we always have to work 2-3 times as hard to fundraise, to campaign, to have that most experience, when, on the other side, like, a white man can come in and talk about his love of the community and have less experience, or throw his resume and credentials as if that's the credential for working with, and have this sense of entitlement, whereas we have to work and fight for it, and we also have to believe that we deserve a place at the table. And I think that was really challenging, is to really believe that, in putting our foot forward, that we're really going up against the grain, and to recognize the institutional challenges that we have to deal with, and then just the coded language of, during the campaign, of, I even though I was running as someone who was bringing fresh perspectives and values to the community, even in the media, they were portraying me as the diverse candidate, and I'm always seen as the diverse candidate. But I'm not there to rep just to meet a status quo or to sort of be that diverse face at the table. Like, I'm there really representing the community. I have the experience. I've built those connections over the years. I've done the work. But even then, people aren't basing me off of experience. They see me as being that diverse candidate. And for me, it's once again having to prove to people that I'm not just here to represent one community. I'm here to represent communities. But unfortunately, the reality of the world that we live in, that's sort of like what we're working with as well. There's this coded racism and sexism that goes at play.
Thank you for that, Kim. And Representative Meng, welcome. Thank you so much for making time for us today. And we would just, as you know, this is a panel of really, truly amazing women, Asian American women who have run for office in Houston, Texas for federal office. And Kim is an elected member of actually my very local small village of Skokie here in Illinois. And Betty is the controller and the the 10th woman to have won a statewide seat in the state of California since statehood. We did have a conversation about how ridiculous that was. And so you're in great company, and we would love to hear from you, Representative Meng, about why you decided to run and what inspired you.
Sure. Thank you to the Napa family for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with all of you. To our controller, Betty E., who I've seen in person and admired from afar. You're such a role model for so many of us across the country. Kem, nice to meet you. Seema, I'm a huge fan of Seema. I'm one of her cheerleaders and a member of her fan club, and look forward to continue watching her star rise as well. And why did I run? I never planned on running for office, right? I had a bunch of internships in both state and federal government agencies and was really wanting to work within the halls of government. I just thought it was really cool to be at the table and that there weren't many people who looked like me, whether women or people of color, and never thought specifically about running for office myself. I got involved in a few campaigns locally and realized that, hey, maybe I could use my community experience and make, government services more accessible for people in my community. So that was in the state legislature. And then it was pretty sudden that I had an opportunity to run for Congress. The then current Congress member was retiring, and I had about 36 hours to decide whether I was going to run for office. And I probably spent like the first 12 hours looking for someone to run, helping to look for candidates, and just never thinking that it would be me. I had not been in the state leg for that long at the time, but one of the things that really got me to run for federal office was that there were no Asian Americans at the time in Congress from New York or on the East Coast. And I just thought, if I don't do this now, I don't know when the next opportunity for someone from our community to represent us at the federal level from New York would be. And so I decided to go for it.
Wow, that's amazing. You made a life decision in 24 hours because you spent 12 hours looking for somebody else. That's pretty amazing. So, I mean, we talked, a lot of us talked about representation actually in answering this first question. And this question might sound so obvious, but everyone gave such great nuggets of wisdom. So I just want to ask you again, like, why do you think it's important for people who look like us to run for office?
I think hearing some of what Kem said, I didn't think that someone like me would run for office. I'd never really seen people in leadership positions, especially in politics, that looked like me. And that saying, you can't be what you can't see. And so it was never a reality for me. But I've realized as I've gotten more involved, as I've gotten older, that some of the things that hold me back were that, oh, my story was unconventional, right? I didn't fit the narrative of what a politician looked like. But as I get more involved, I've realized that those are the very exact reasons why we need to run for office and why we need to be involved. And I've realized and learned a lot of lessons from my sisters in the Black and Latino communities, that if we're not in those rooms where decisions are being made, then there might literally be no one to speak up for our communities. And even though our stories seem a little bit unconventional, but that's exactly the reason why we need to be in those spaces, to make sure that people understand and hear our stories, our experiences. Otherwise, there will be gaps in services that are provided because no one might talk about what our communities need.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'll transition back to bringing everybody into the conversation now. And this is a sort of a improvised question, but I would love to hear, like, if you could tell us one story of like a moment where you were so proud of your candidacy, your public leadership. Like, what is that one moment or story that you could share with us? And I'll just let anybody who's ready to speak first, because this is something you have to think about for a minute.
So I think I'll start. One of the things that I think, because we work so hard to get to these positions and in our campaigns and get elected, that I really have thought back about just what was I able to do with all that. And I love the fact that we can kind of center, focus, issues of equity and justice and so much of the work that we do, and particularly first and foremost for our own communities, but really for all communities who have been disproportionately affected or have been marginalized over the course of our history and our policies. But I do have to say that, I mean, to be in a position where I can actually bring more women into this ecosystem has been really one of the proudest moments. I'm happy to say that the overwhelming majority of my senior staff are in disciplines that have been traditionally occupied by, men, and in the investments world, and in the taxation world, in the public affairs world, and environmental policy. And I think it's important to think about that because, I always think about the fact that I am only the 10th woman ever elected to a statewide office in progressive California, and that just has to change. And the way that changes is that we actually have a lot that we can do to bring more women, into leadership positions, decision-making roles, and that's something I know that when I leave this office, I'll be very proud of.
Thank you.
So I want to go back to what Betty shared earlier about authenticity. And I'd say for me, even though I'm in a very local position, by being the first Asian American, not the first Cambodian American woman to be elected to any position in the country, that sort of came to a head for me in the last presidential election, like leading up to it. So there was a video ad, I think, that came out of California, where I think Fresno, California, there was a contested election, and there was a Cambodian American woman who ran as a Republican against the Democratic incumbent, ran against the institution, and she used our story, the story of the Cambodian genocide, to talk about socialism and AOC's New Deal. And so they had an image of AOC's face blowing up in flames, and so this was in select media throughout the country, and talking sort of like building on this fear, right, of socialism and the new Green Deal, and it was so traumatizing, such a trigger for our community, and people were looking for a space to really speak up and not knowing how to. And for a moment, like I also serve as president of the National Cambodian Heritage Museum. And I was sort of like waiting for someone else to speak up, and then like I thought that maybe because we have a genocide museum out in Cambodia as well, I thought the director there would speak up, and he didn't. He's from a different generation, and he felt like it was a political comment that he didn't want to get involved in U.S. politics. And then I realized there's no one else to speak up but me, so I was like, okay, and then I realized I carried that responsibility, and I did put out an op-ed in Color Lines and sort of called out, not using our community and our people's history and pain and politicizing it for any political party, regardless, right? So even though I hold a very local position, it's very personal, and in terms of representation and being able to have that public platform to speak on these issues that are important for our communities as well. And for me, that was sort of a moment where I really sort of it became really real for me, and why it was important that I had a place there in order to speak.
Thank you. That's really powerful, Kim. Thank you.
I think for me, what Betty said, empowering women was very important, especially in our API communities, because whether being on a grassroots level or donor level or even volunteering on the campaign, so many conversations that I had with people, like a lot of people didn't think they would make a difference or they can make a difference. But especially when all these um, hate incidences started around, especially within the API community, I think having conversations with several people from different generation, this is so generational also, understanding how important it is to be involved and have your voices heard. I just saw from younger people volunteering, from women just coming in and wanting to knock doors and have conversations, and having been so shy and not wanting to really have their voices heard, but making that difference, knowing how much is going to make a difference, and seeing that by putting their word out there, other people hear their stories, especially the women. That really, I mean, I have many, many stories of different women like this, but that was very strong to me. Uh, and was very special to me to realize, to even be able to give that kind of a maybe strength to these women to participate and know that their voices matter so much however they get involved. And I ended up having a big group of volunteers that now are doing all kinds of other things, but that meant a lot to me.
Thank you.
I think for me, and this story means a lot to me, even though it's kind of old, because this time that our community is going through and the importance of allyship and lessons that we've actually been learning over the past few months. Um, I wanted to share it because a few years back, I was trying to get onto the appropriations committee. And there's, long story short, but there's a select group of members who help select new committee members. At the time, there weren't any Asians appropriations committee. I mean, can you imagine the entire appropriations committee and no Asian Americans? And there weren't really enough Asian Americans like in that room to advocate for the community and advocate for the committee. And so some of my colleagues from the Black and Hispanic caucus actually spoke up for me, saying that it was important that the Asian American community's needs and voices were heard on that committee, which funds all the government agents, all the federal agencies. And so in that moment, I feel like in some ways, even though it was something that I personally wanted, but it was something that, and I felt like in that moment, I kind of witnessed the growth of our community and was symbolic of what more we need to do, especially in the of allyship, that speaking up for each other and standing up for each other, and that there are issues that we've worked on locally that might not be possible had not my colleagues from the Black and Hispanic caucus not spoken up for me and helped me get onto the committee. And so at that moment, I felt like, all right, this is allyship and at the same time empowering our own AAPI community, which needed a greater presence in Congress. So I really think that that's one of my favorite moments.
Thank you. And in wrapping up, I would love to hear just one piece of advice. If there's one thing you could tell somebody who's on the fence or wants to run, like what it could be practical, it could be ideological, whatever. Like, what is the one thing you would like to tell folks who are listening, especially Asian American women who are thinking about running for office at some level?
I would just say, don't be afraid and do it. You don't need to ask permission from anyone. You know, it is important that your voice is heard, and you cannot be a silent participant in the world around you anymore. We cannot be bystanders, and we just have to go ahead and do it, and we can make the changes. Just don't be afraid. And there are many, many people. I mean, look, incredible women on this call that will be mentors and will help you through. It's just amazing to see the support that is out there if you just look at it and just go ahead and do it.
I would add that it's important to be authentic. And I say this because hindsight's 2020. I've spent so much of my time earlier days in politics kind of on the defense, like what I say, what I do, what I look like, will it be deemed American enough and acceptable enough? But I've realized, especially in this past year, that we as Asian Americans do not have to be on the defense of what people might think or consider to be American enough. Our history, our background, our experiences, they are as American as anyone else's. And so when you're telling your story, when you're talking about what you're doing to help your local communities, be authentic and be yourself, because people will feel that. They will relate to that, and it'll empower you as you tell your story too.
I was asked to run for village trustee in Skokie once again, and it was one of those things where I kind of held off, like I don't want to do this, and I was repeatedly asked, and there hasn't been any representation on the village board as far as having a younger Asian American woman on the board. And what I think I realized was when you you realize how painful it is to say no, and then you realize that you're the person that needs to step up and take the responsibility to be that advocate, to be that voice, because no one else is there, and that you're much needed in that space. That's your calling. That's what we need to think about, because it's no longer about you personally. It's about the community, and how can you best serve that community.
And I'll just say there's space for you. Your voice is needed, and just I think part of the challenge, but also the reward of campaigning. It just I can't think of any other time in my life where I've taken stock of what my life has been about, and it is rich. We all come from very, very rich backgrounds, and yes, we know what it takes to win campaigns, but at the same time, to Representative Meng's point about being authentic, and Kim, all of us spoke about this. There's something very powerful about our own stories, because they're uniquely ours, and nobody can take that away from us. And it does really help connect us with others who have been through similar journeys, certainly experiencing the same challenges in these days. But I marvel every day, and I count my blessings every day that I wasn't meant to be here, to serve as the CFO of the fifth largest economy, growing up like I did, poor, second oldest of 6 children to immigrant parents. But and what I'd like to finally say now is, for somebody who didn't speak English until she got to kindergarten, and took care of the books for my family's laundry and dry cleaning business, I now have the great privilege of taking care of the books for the great state of California. So it's possible, and there is space, and your voice is needed.
Oh my goodness, Betty, that just made me tear up. Just the image, of like your bookkeeping for your parents, and now in the state of California. I think that's such a great image of the possibilities when we step in and we're brave. And so I just want to thank you all on this panel for your courage, whether you decided to do it on your own or you were, coerced, bribed, tricked, however you want to look at it. But I'm just so amazed and thankful for your leadership, because, it is because of people like you who are literally trailblazing that we get to have a more fair and more equal and more diverse America. And so I hope that our viewers today take courage and tips and encouragement from this call, and knowing that we're all here for each other to encourage our leadership in whatever way we show up authentically. I have heard that that is the magic sauce to um, how we can really be successful and be true to ourselves in all that we do in leadership. So thank you so much for all your time. I really appreciate it. And we're wrapping up our series with one last panel next week where we will be talking about policy priorities for the Asian American community, especially for women and girls from a gender perspective. And we will be joined by executive directors of our partner organizations at Epic and Conwin and Upnagar, and Heart Women and Girls, which are Muslim woman-led, PI woman-led, and a Korean woman-led organization. So please join us for that conversation on the 27th afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. Bye-bye.